Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and I was doing quite a bit of reading the last few days, as I often do, on topics of nutrition, epidemiology, various diseases, obesity, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and I did some thinking, which is something I also on occasion do. And one of the things that always catches my interest is at a couple of different points. You're seeing all the paleo movement doing this now, the low carb movement still doing it, although it was started a lot of guys like Dr. East, Dr. Atkins talked about this stuff. They talked about the Inuits. And for those of you who don't know, that's Eskimos and their traditional diet. And I've actually had read all the material those doctors have put out on this stuff. I actually had read all of their books at one time, so keep that in perspective. I'm not ignorant of their stance. And I am familiar with the references to these tribes. And then all this talk from the paleo people now about grains not being part of our traditional natural diet. And both of these things that they discuss are essentially fallacies. Now, I don't often link data, and I'll link a little quick study down below. And something that's been found over the years, all of these people talk about, oh, the Inuits, they have lower heart disease. Actually, that's not true. They have, compared to mainstream white America in the modern day, they had lower rates of a single type of cardiovascular disease compared to them, but their total deaths from all cumulative heart disease for this nomadic hunter-gatherer tribe, their total death rate from cardiovascular disease is just as high as mainstream America. So essentially, when you see a statistic like that and you see data verifying that, that's basically saying they're the second most unhealthy population on Earth due to their diet. Because mainstream white America, diet-wise, is the most unhealthy population on Earth. So if the Inuits are dying at the same rate, their diet is pretty terrible. And even though some other diseases they die at lower rates or had less of these diseases than mainstream white America, that doesn't look very good, because if you just have a lower rate and that's your only claim to fame for something, then that means you're the second worst in the world. Because the American diet is the worst on Earth demographically. Now, other countries have started becoming westernized and they want to adopt the American lifestyle, so we're seeing all these statistics rise all around the world of everything from higher obesity rates, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, all these things. So now we're spreading our poison to the rest of the world and our lifestyle, and a lot of that's largely diet, and a lot of it is activity, but our excess from our diet, the way that we eat is a factor. And it's always interesting, though, that they want to cite the Inuits as being healthy. Well, a nomadic tribe, this is the only nomadic tribe we have that seems to have had cardiovascular diseases as high of a rate as the American population. So that's pretty terrible in and of itself. But then even the early researchers who talked about their lower rates of certain types of diseases, who went and lived with them years ago, noted their body fat. It was always noted that they were a rotund people even back then. So even their diet being used as a method for weight loss, when most nomadic and hunter-gatherers and indigenous peoples tend to be relatively lean, they're fat. So discussing such an example in terms of weight loss seems really absurd to use that demographic is any sort of idea for that. And the other thing that throws me off, because it ties back to grains, and they didn't eat grains, they didn't really eat plants of any type, they live on an all-meat, high-fat diet. Due to their environment, they don't have a choice. But this goes back to the point, it's always interesting. You always have the paleo crowd who always say things like, well, grains are our enemy. Well, no, here's the reality. Grains are part of a Paleolithic diet. If you look throughout the world, if you don't go all the way into the Arctic regions, you go through most of the world and most of the regions of the world where humans have lived during the Paleolithic era and were the largest population centers all around the world, with the most thriving populations even of tribes. When you find archaeology records, even going back before the agrarian age, when we find fossils, we always find grains in their GI tract. When we find fossilized remains where we can see what was in their stomachs, they always have grains. And in fact, we have found more total grains in there than we have found animal tissue. And the reality is, we know that throughout most of the regions of the world, even during Paleolithic times, meat was not something tribes got to eat every day unless they were fishing tribes that lived by the coast and they fished every day. In which case they got fish every day, but as far as actual wild game, this isn't something our ancestors got on a daily basis. We probably ate more grains even tens of thousands of years ago than we got fresh meat. And the big kills were a big deal, and they gorged on it because it might be a week before they got a mammoth again or a deer. So yeah, they gorged on that stuff when they got it, and they went back to eating plants and tubers, and yes, potatoes, grains. Those are the sort of things that they ate in addition to insects. They got most of their protein from insects. And I don't see paleo people sitting around eating grains, potatoes, and insects, which actually would be a legitimate paleo diet, and then getting a gigantic meat meal once a week to where you gorge yourself till you're sick. And then that's the only meat you're going to get for a week. So you could maybe make that your Sunday meal. And none of them follow that, so it's really absurd that they have that anti-grain thing as if that was some sort of, with a naturalistic fallacy, if that's the way that our natural diet is. We ate grains anytime we found them, and there's evidence that we found a lot of them. And the reality is, when we step back and look at the whole grain issue, the healthiest cultures around the world with the lowest rates of obesity, with the lowest rates of diabetes, with the lowest rates of cardiovascular disease, have starch-based diets. You can research this all over the net, all over demographics, epidemiology, and of course, correlation does not equal causation, but we certainly see it. And we see it even with, say, the Japanese eating, and the Chinese traditionally eating tons of white rice. These people still have low rates of all of those, and they tend to have low body fats. Now, a lot of people will cite the Mediterranean diet as being extremely healthy, even though it is higher fat, because all those are low-fat, starch-based diets. Mediterranean diet is higher in fat, but it tends to be olive oil. It's always monounsaturated fats. Lean proteins and tons of grains and fruit. But again, tons of grains and fruit. But the difference is, of course, is that the Mediterraneans were not as lean as some of the Eastern cultures that are purely starch-based in their diet and got the vast majority of their calories from starch. And it makes sense because, again, they're getting higher caloric density from the olive oil. It's easier to store dietary fat as fat than it is starches by a dramatically large amount, because healthy people don't generally store carbs as fat. And so it makes sense they would have slightly higher body fat, but their diet was overall healthy enough, balanced enough, and then they're eating these just very heart-healthy monounsaturated fats, and obviously their rates of cardiovascular disease are almost non-existent also. But in terms of body composition, the Japanese went out. So there you have it, guys. This whole Inuit thing is a myth. This whole idea that Paleolithic man were not grain eaters is a myth. And this idea that starch-based diets haven't been the basis of the most healthiest cultures, who are all dramatically healthier than we are in the West in the modern day, were not starch-based, because they were. All right, guys, so that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it has been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time. But let me give you guys a bicep shot before I go. Oh, eat your rice.